Eleanor Grant had spent 42 years believing her family was unbreakable. At 66, she had lived through enough hardships to think she understood what loss looked like. Yet nothing in her life had prepared her for the quiet betrayal that would begin at a simple Sunday dinner. Just 6 weeks earlier, her husband Daniel Grant had died unexpectedly from what doctors described as a sudden cardiac event. The news had shocked everyone. Daniel had always seemed healthy, disciplined with his morning walks, careful with his diet, and stubbornly independent even at 70. For Eleanor, the loss had carved a silent emptiness into the walls of their large colonial home just outside Hartford, Connecticut. It was the same house they had bought together when their oldest child was still a baby, a house that had grown alongside their family. Their 2 children had built lives of their own long ago. Their son Andrew lived nearby with his wife Melissa and their 2 young daughters. Their daughter Claire had moved across the country to Denver after college and only visited a few times a year. Despite the distance, Eleanor had always believed that family loyalty ran deeper than geography. Daniel had believed the same. Their home had always been the center of every holiday, every birthday, every summer barbecue. That Sunday dinner was meant to bring some of that old warmth back. Eleanor spent the entire day preparing the meal the way Daniel loved it. Roast chicken with rosemary and garlic, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and the lemon pie he used to insist on every Sunday evening. She carefully laid out the dining table with the same porcelain plates they had received as a wedding gift decades earlier. A small bouquet of white tulips sat in the center beside 2 tall candles she lit just before the guests arrived. Andrew arrived first. He gave his mother a brief hug that felt mechanical, his arms barely wrapping around her shoulders before he stepped back. "The house smells great, Mom," he said, though his eyes were already drifting around the room, scanning the furniture, the paintings, even the staircase leading upstairs. Eleanor noticed the way his gaze lingered on things as if he were studying them. Melissa walked in behind him, tapping quickly on her phone. She offered a polite greeting without looking up. Their daughters, Lily and Emma, rushed forward with genuine excitement, wrapping their arms around Eleanor's waist. "Grandma, we missed you." Their laughter briefly warmed the room. Claire arrived 20 minutes later after a delayed flight from Colorado. She hugged Eleanor longer than Andrew had, though something about her expression seemed distracted, almost tense. Dinner began quietly. For the first 20 minutes, conversation revolved around small things: the girls' school activities, Claire's job in marketing, Andrew's recent promotion at his company. Eleanor tried to enjoy the moment, but a strange tension floated beneath the conversation. Every time she looked up, she caught Andrew and Melissa exchanging brief glances. Finally, Andrew cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, setting down his fork, "have you thought about what you're going to do with the house?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" Melissa leaned forward slightly, her tone carefully measured. "This place is pretty large for one person. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming." Eleanor forced a small smile. "I've been managing fine. But realistically," Andrew continued, "you can't stay here forever." The words landed harder than he probably intended. Eleanor glanced around the dining room. Every wall held memories. The doorway where their children's heights had been marked year after year. The piano Daniel used to play on quiet winter evenings. The house wasn't just property, it was their entire life. "I'm not planning to leave," she said calmly. Melissa's lips tightened. "Well," she said, "the market is really strong right now. Homes in this neighborhood are selling for nearly $900,000. Andrew nodded. "If you sold now, you could move somewhere smaller. Maybe a nice condo or assisted living community." Eleanor felt a sudden chill run through her. "Assisted living?" she repeated. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "No one is saying you need that immediately," Andrew added quickly. "But we should think long-term." Eleanor folded her napkin slowly. "This house belongs to me," she said. "Your father and I built our life here." Andrew exchanged a quick glance with Melissa, before speaking again. Actually, about that. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Dad's lawyer explained the will last week. Andrew continued. The house is technically part of the estate. Eleanor frowned. What are you talking about? According to the paperwork, Melissa said carefully, the property was refinanced about 8 years ago. It ended up in Daniel's name alone. That's impossible, Eleanor replied. Andrew leaned back in his chair. The will says all major assets are to be divided equally between Claire and me. The words felt unreal. And where exactly does that leave me? Eleanor asked. Melissa shrugged lightly. You'd receive a housing allowance from the estate. A housing allowance? Andrew spoke more firmly now. You could stay with us temporarily while we arrange something more suitable. The suggestion stunned her. Andrew and Melissa lived in a small 2-bedroom townhouse. Where exactly would I stay? Eleanor asked quietly. Melissa gave a small laugh. The pull-out sofa in the living room would work for now. The casual cruelty of the comment filled the room with silence. Claire looked down at her plate. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair. I think dinner is over. Andrew looked annoyed. Mom, don't be dramatic. I said dinner is over. The grandchildren watched nervously as Eleanor began clearing dishes. Melissa lifted her wine glass with a thin smile. Well, she said lightly, here's to the most controlling mother-in-law in Connecticut trying to block her children's inheritance. The words froze the room. Andrew didn't laugh. He didn't defend his mother either. Eleanor set the dish down carefully. You should leave, she said quietly. That night she cried alone in the bedroom she had shared with Daniel for 4 decades. But by morning something inside her had changed. Andrew and Melissa had been struggling financially for months. Daniel had insisted on helping them quietly, sending a check each month directly to their landlord. The next rent payment was already written. Eleanor stared at the envelope for a long time before picking up the phone. She called the bank and canceled the check. 30 minutes later, Andrew called her. His voice was shaking with anger. Mom, what did you do? Eleanor looked out the window at the backyard garden Daniel used to tend every spring. Oh, she said calmly. It seems you'll have your own housing problem now. The morning after Eleanor canceled the rent payment, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. For several days, her phone remained completely quiet. Andrew did not call again. Melissa sent no angry messages, and even Claire's brief text stopped. At first, Eleanor thought the quiet might mean her children were reconsidering their behavior. But by the 3rd day, she began to understand the silence differently. It felt less like peace and more like a strategy. The house, once filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, now seemed to echo with emptiness. The ticking of the kitchen clock sounded louder than usual, and every creak of the wooden floors reminded her how alone she was. Yet instead of frightening her, the quiet gave Eleanor something she had not had in years: time to think. She began going through Daniel's study. For decades, Eleanor had respected that room as her husband's private space. Daniel handled most of the family's finances, paperwork, and investments, and Eleanor had trusted him completely. Their marriage had always been built on shared responsibility, but Daniel had naturally taken the role of managing documents and legal matters. Eleanor handled the household, her work as a librarian, and the endless daily details of raising 2 children. They had never hidden things from each other, but they also rarely questioned each other's roles. Now, standing inside the study surrounded by file cabinets and shelves of carefully labeled folders, Eleanor felt both guilty and determined. If Andrew was telling the truth about the house, she needed to see the evidence herself. She started with the oldest documents first. At the back of a large metal cabinet, she found the original mortgage paperwork from when they purchased the house in 1983. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the thick stack of papers. There, printed clearly on the first page, were both names: Daniel Grant and Eleanor Grant, listed together as equal owners. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. That was exactly what she remembered. They had signed those papers together, sitting side by side in a small office with a young real estate attorney who had congratulated them on their first real home. But Andrew had mentioned refinancing. Eleanor continued searching until she found a folder labeled Mortgage Adjustment, 2015. When she opened it, the relief quickly faded. The newer documents listed only Daniel's name. Her own name appeared nowhere on the updated deed. Eleanor stared at the page for a long time. She tried to remember that year clearly. Daniel had expanded his consulting business around that time and had spoken often about improving their financial structure. They had signed several documents during those months, many related to business loans and tax adjustments. Eleanor remembered trusting Daniel to guide them through the process. But she could not recall any conversation about removing her name from the property. It didn't feel like something Daniel would do quietly. Their marriage had always been open, practical, honest. Daniel had never made large decisions without discussing them with her first. The more Eleanor thought about it, the less the situation made sense. Later that afternoon, she called Daniel's lawyer, a man named Thomas Keller who had worked with their family for over 20 years. Unfortunately, Keller's assistant informed her that he was currently traveling abroad and would not return for at least another week. Eleanor explained that she needed clarification about the will and the house documents. The assistant listened politely, but said no one else in the office could discuss the details without Keller present. The call ended with Eleanor feeling more unsettled than before. By the end of the week, she realized she needed advice from someone she trusted personally. That person was Margaret Holden. Margaret had been Eleanor's close friend for nearly 30 years and had spent most of her career as a family law attorney before retiring 2 years earlier. They met for coffee at a quiet cafe near the public library where Eleanor used to work. Margaret listened carefully as Eleanor explained everything: the dinner, Andrew's claim about the will, the refinance papers, and the sudden suggestion that she sell the house and move out. Margaret did not interrupt until Eleanor finished speaking. "Something about this situation isn't right," Margaret finally said. Eleanor looked up. "What do you mean?" Margaret folded her hands thoughtfully. Even if the property was temporarily placed under Daniel's name during refinancing, the law still recognizes long-term marital property rights. After more than 40 years of marriage, it would be extremely unusual for a spouse to be left with no claim at all. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. So Andrew might be wrong? He might be misinformed, Margaret said carefully. Or he might be interpreting the will in a way that benefits him. The possibility hung in the air between them. Margaret continued, speaking more seriously. "Before you confront anyone, you need documentation. Get a certified copy of Daniel's will. Review every financial account connected to both of you. And most importantly, make sure your access to those accounts hasn't been changed." Eleanor nodded slowly. That same afternoon, she drove to the bank where she and Daniel had held their accounts for decades. The building felt familiar, yet strangely different now that she was entering alone. The bank manager, a middle-aged man named Stephen who had known the Grants for years, greeted her politely and invited her into his office. Eleanor explained that she wanted to review several of their joint accounts. Stephen typed quietly on his computer, his expression gradually becoming more serious. "Mrs. Grant," he said after a moment, "there have been some recent changes." "What kind of changes?" Stephen turned the screen slightly toward her. "Two of the accounts that were previously listed under both you and Mr. Grant now show Andrew Grant as an authorized co-signer." Eleanor blinked in confusion. "That must be a mistake." Stephen shook his head gently. "The paperwork was filed about 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago. Daniel had died just over a month earlier. "Did I sign anything approving this?" Eleanor asked. Stephen pulled up the digital files. "The authorization appears to have been signed by your husband before his passing." Eleanor stared at the scanned signature on the screen. It looked like Daniel's handwriting, but something about it felt wrong. She requested copies of every document connected to the accounts over the past 6 months. Stephen printed them without hesitation. Though Eleanor noticed, he watched her carefully as she gathered the papers into her folder. When she returned home later that afternoon, she was surprised to see a familiar figure standing near her front porch.
Claire.
Her daughter looked tired from travel, her hair tied loosely back as if she had arrived in a hurry. "Mom," Claire said, "we need to talk." Eleanor unlocked the front door and motioned for her to come inside. Claire remained standing in the hallway, glancing around the house as though it already belonged to someone else. "Andrew called me," Claire said. "I assumed he would."
Claire sighed.
"Why are you making this harder than it has to be?" Eleanor felt a slow burn of anger rise in her chest. "I canceled one rent check, Claire. That's hardly a war." Claire crossed her arms. "Andrew says you're refusing to cooperate with Dad's final wishes. Then I'd like to see those wishes." Claire hesitated. "You mean the will?" "Yes." Claire looked uncomfortable. "I haven't actually read it myself. Andrew explained it to me." The admission made Eleanor's suspicion grow stronger. "So you're taking his word for everything?" Claire didn't answer immediately. "He said Dad wanted the house sold, so the estate could be divided fairly." "And what about me?" Eleanor asked quietly. Claire looked down. "He said there was a housing allowance for you." The words sounded hollow even as Claire said them. Eleanor took a slow breath. "Claire, your father and I spent our entire adult lives building this home. Do you truly believe he would suddenly decide to leave me dependent on your brother's generosity?" Claire hesitated again. "I don't know what to believe." That evening after Claire left for the airport, Eleanor sat alone in Daniel's study reviewing the bank documents again. Something about the timeline bothered her. Several financial transfers had occurred during the months before Daniel's death. Some money had moved into accounts she did not recognize. One document especially caught her attention. It was a life insurance policy dated only 6 months earlier. Eleanor had never seen it before. The listed beneficiary was not her. It was a family trust in Andrew and Claire's names. The discovery sent a chill down her spine. Daniel had always insisted that Eleanor be the primary beneficiary of any insurance policy. That had been their agreement for decades. Yet here was a new policy she had never heard about, signed only months before he died. For the first time since Daniel's death, a disturbing thought crossed Eleanor's mind. What if Daniel hadn't made these decisions himself? What if someone else had made them for him? Eleanor looked down at the signature on the insurance policy. It resembled Daniel's handwriting. But just like the bank documents, something about it didn't look exactly right. 2 days after Claire's brief visit, Eleanor received an unexpected envelope delivered by courier. It arrived just after noon while she was in the kitchen making tea, and the sharp knock on the door startled her more than it should have. The delivery driver handed her a flat brown envelope marked with the letterhead of Thomas Keller's law office. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she closed the door behind her and walked slowly to the dining table. She had requested information about Daniel's will, but Keller was still abroad. The assistant had told her no one else could release documents until he returned. Yet someone from the office had clearly decided to send something anyway. Inside the envelope was a brief typed note explaining that a copy of Daniel Grant's most recent will was enclosed as a courtesy. What unsettled Eleanor immediately was the second sentence. It stated that the request had been made through a phone call earlier that week from someone identifying herself as Eleanor Grant. The problem was simple. Eleanor had never made that call. She had asked Keller's assistant about the will, but she had not formally requested a copy or provided verification. Someone else had pretended to be her. Eleanor unfolded the document carefully and began reading. The will was dated 7 months before Daniel's death. According to the text, it replaced a much older will the couple had written together nearly 15 years earlier. The document instructed that the house be sold within 6 months of Daniel's passing, with the profits divided equally between Andrew and Claire. Eleanor herself was granted what the document described as reasonable financial support for housing and living expenses, but the authority to determine what qualified as reasonable was assigned to the estate's trustee. The trustee was Andrew. Eleanor felt the room grow colder. If the will were genuine, Andrew would essentially control her financial future. He could decide where she lived, how much money she received, and how the family home was sold. The power granted to him felt excessive, almost personal. Daniel had always been a careful planner, but he had also been deeply protective of Eleanor's independence. The idea that he would intentionally leave her dependent on Andrew's judgment seemed impossible. Her eyes moved to the final page. At the bottom sat Daniel's signature. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at it. She had seen Daniel's handwriting thousands of times over the course of their marriage. Grocery lists, birthday cards, short notes left on the refrigerator door. His signature had always had a particular rhythm to it, smooth and slightly curved with a distinctive loop in the capital D. The signature on the will looked similar, but the more she examined it, the more something felt wrong. The lines were sharper, almost hesitant, as if someone had copied the shape without capturing the natural flow. Eleanor immediately gathered several other documents Daniel had signed within the same year. She laid them side by side across the dining table. At first glance, the signatures looked nearly identical, but the longer she compared them, the clearer the differences became. The angle of the final letter, the pressure of the pen, the spacing between the initials, small details that most people would never notice suddenly seemed obvious. The signature on the will didn't quite match. Eleanor sat back slowly in her chair. The possibility that someone had forged Daniel's signature was terrifying. Forgery meant fraud. Fraud meant deliberate planning. And if someone had gone that far, it meant the situation surrounding Daniel's finances was far more complicated than she had originally believed. She called Margaret Holden immediately. Margaret arrived at the house that evening carrying her reading glasses and a legal notepad. Eleanor showed her the will, the bank documents, and the insurance policy she had discovered earlier. Margaret studied everything quietly for nearly 20 minutes before speaking. "I can't confirm forgery myself," Margaret said carefully, "but I will say this. The signature on the will does not appear consistent with the others." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "So, I'm not imagining it."
No, Margaret replied.
"You're not imagining it." They discussed possible explanations late into the evening. One possibility was that Daniel had been ill or under medication when signing the document, which could have affected his handwriting. Another possibility was that someone had pressured him into signing something he did not fully understand. But the most troubling possibility was the one Eleanor could barely bring herself to say aloud. Someone might have signed it for him. The next morning, Eleanor woke up after barely sleeping. Her thoughts kept returning to the same questions. If the will was forged, who would have done it? Andrew had the most to gain financially, but accusing her own son of such a crime felt almost impossible to accept. Still, Andrew had already demonstrated a willingness to manipulate the situation. His insistence that she sell the house quickly now seemed more suspicious than ever. That afternoon, the situation escalated. Eleanor received a call from the elementary school where her granddaughter Emma studied. The receptionist explained that Emma had fallen during recess and needed to be picked up early. The school had tried calling both Andrew and Melissa, but couldn't reach either of them. "Could you come get her, Mrs. Grant?" the receptionist asked. "Of course," Eleanor replied without hesitation. Emma was sitting in the nurse's office when Eleanor arrived, her knee covered in a small bandage, but her spirits surprisingly high. The girl smiled brightly when she saw her grandmother. "Grandma, you came?" Eleanor hugged her gently. "Of course I did." On the drive back to the house, Emma chatted about school projects, her friends, and a new science experiment her class was planning. Eleanor listened closely, grateful for the distraction from her worries. For a short time, the day felt almost normal again. When they arrived home, Eleanor texted Andrew to let him know Emma was safe.
He didn't respond.
2 hours later, the doorbell rang sharply. Andrew stood on the porch, looking furious. Emma was coloring in the living room when he stepped inside. "Emma, go wait in the car," he said abruptly. "But Dad..."
Now.
The girl looked confused, but obeyed. As soon as the front door closed behind her, Andrew turned toward his mother. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Eleanor remained calm. "The school called me because they couldn't reach you. It was a scraped knee," Andrew snapped. You had no right to take her. I called you. I texted you. Andrew's jaw tightened. You're trying to manipulate things. Eleanor stared at him. How exactly is picking up my injured granddaughter manipulation? Andrew paced across the room. You're using the kids to make us look like the bad guys. First the rent check, now this. The accusation stunned her. You think I canceled the rent check because of the house, Eleanor said slowly. But I did it because I realized something important. You don't get to threaten me and still expect financial help. Andrew stopped pacing. Threaten you? Yes, Eleanor said firmly. Selling my home without my consent sounds very much like a threat. Andrew's voice grew colder. It's not your home. Eleanor reached into the folder on the table and pulled out the will. Then explain this. Andrew's eyes flickered when he saw the document. You already know what it says. Yes, Eleanor replied. I've read it carefully, and I have questions. What kind of questions? Questions about the signature. For the first time, Andrew looked genuinely unsettled. What about it? It doesn't match your father's handwriting. Andrew's expression hardened instantly. Are you accusing someone of something? I'm asking for an explanation. Andrew stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen carefully, Mom. You're grieving, and grief makes people imagine things. Eleanor held his gaze. No, she said quietly. Grief makes people pay attention. Andrew's patience snapped. Fine, he said sharply. You want to fight this? We can fight it in court. Eleanor felt a chill. Andrew continued. If this goes to court, we'll have to discuss your mental state. Your recent behavior could easily be interpreted as instability. The implication was clear. He was threatening to have her declared mentally incompetent. Eleanor stared at her son, struggling to recognize the person standing in front of her. Get out, she said quietly. Andrew didn't move. You're making a mistake. Get out of my house. After a long moment, Andrew turned and walked out the door without another word. When the car disappeared down the street, Eleanor sank slowly onto the hallway bench. Her hands were shaking. But despite the fear building in her chest, one realization had become crystal clear. Andrew had reacted far too strongly to a simple question about a signature. And that reaction meant only one thing. He was hiding something. After Andrew left the house that afternoon, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet hallway for a long time, trying to steady her breathing. The confrontation had confirmed something she had feared but not wanted to believe. Andrew wasn't just pushing her to sell the house because he thought it was practical. He was desperate. His reaction to the will, the sudden threat to question her mental competence, and the anger that had flashed across his face when she mentioned the signature all pointed to the same conclusion. Something was wrong in Andrew's life, something serious enough to drive him into actions Eleanor could barely recognize as belonging to the son she had raised. That night, Eleanor locked every door in the house and double-checked the windows before going to bed. It was the first time she had ever felt uneasy inside the home she and Daniel had built together. The sense of safety she had once taken for granted now felt fragile. She slept only a few hours before waking in the early morning darkness, her mind racing with possibilities. If Andrew had forged the will or manipulated Daniel's finances, then he must have been planning it for months. That meant there were likely more changes she hadn't discovered yet. Eleanor spent the rest of the morning reviewing documents again, making careful notes the way she had done for years while cataloging books at the library. The methodical process helped calm her thoughts. By midday, she decided it was time to take more serious action. Margaret had already suggested that Eleanor consider speaking with someone experienced in investigations, someone who could examine the documents professionally and track the financial changes that had occurred before Daniel's death. Margaret had even recommended a name, a retired financial investigator named Samuel Pierce who occasionally worked as a consultant on legal cases. Eleanor called him that afternoon. Pierce agreed to meet her the following day. The next morning he arrived precisely at 10. Samuel Pierce looked exactly like someone who had spent decades studying complicated financial crimes. He was in his early 60s, calm and observant, dressed in a simple gray suit. After brief introductions, Eleanor showed him the will, the insurance policy, and the bank records she had gathered. Pierce reviewed everything slowly, occasionally asking small questions about dates or family relationships. Eleanor answered each one as clearly as she could. After nearly an hour, Pierce leaned back in his chair. "These changes didn't happen by accident," he said quietly. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "You mean someone planned this?" Pierce nodded. Multiple accounts were adjusted within a narrow time window. That suggests someone had consistent access to Daniel's financial information. Could Daniel have done it himself? "It's possible," Pierce said carefully. "But the pattern is unusual. The changes all shift control away from you and toward Andrew." Eleanor stared at the papers spread across the table. "Then you believe Andrew may have manipulated the accounts?" Pierce didn't answer immediately. "What I believe," he said finally, "is that someone close to Daniel benefited from these changes." Eleanor knew exactly who that someone was. Before Pierce left, he explained that verifying the signature on the will would require a handwriting expert. That process could take several days. He also recommended that Eleanor secure all original documents in a safe place and avoid discussing the investigation openly with Andrew. "You should assume that if someone forged that will," Pierce added, "they won't react calmly when confronted." Later that afternoon, Eleanor took Pierce's advice seriously. She moved the most important papers into a small lockbox she kept hidden in the back of her bedroom closet. She also scheduled an appointment to open a new safe deposit box at the bank the following morning. Taking these precautions made her feel slightly more in control of the situation. But just as she finished organizing the documents, the doorbell rang. When Eleanor opened the door, she found Claire standing on the porch again. This time her daughter looked exhausted. "Mom," Claire said quietly, "I need to talk to you." Eleanor stepped aside to let her in. Claire walked slowly into the living room and sat down on the sofa, rubbing her temples as if she hadn't slept well. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. Claire hesitated before answering. "I had another conversation with Andrew. And," Claire sighed deeply, "something isn't right with him." Eleanor sat across from her. "I've been saying that for weeks." Claire shook her head. "No, I mean really wrong. He's under enormous pressure about money." Eleanor leaned forward. "What kind of pressure?" Claire looked uncertain for a moment before speaking. "He owes people money." "How much?" "I don't know exactly," Claire admitted. "But Melissa hinted it could be hundreds of thousands." Eleanor felt the room spin slightly. "Hundreds of thousands?" Claire nodded. "Apparently he started making risky investments last year. Cryptocurrency, online trading, things like that. At first he made some profit, but then he lost everything." Eleanor tried to process the information. "And now he needs money fast," she said slowly. Claire looked at her mother with concern.
Yes.
"And he believes selling the house would solve his problems." The realization hit Eleanor with terrible clarity. Andrew wasn't just being greedy. He was trying to escape financial disaster. That evening the situation became even more alarming. Just after dinner, Eleanor heard a bicycle stop outside the house. When she opened the door, she saw her older granddaughter Lily standing on the sidewalk. "Grandma," the girl said nervously, "can I come in?" Eleanor welcomed her inside immediately. "What's wrong?" Lily glanced toward the street as if afraid someone might be watching. "Mom and Dad have been fighting a lot," she said quietly. "Last night some men came to our house asking for Dad." Eleanor felt a chill. "What kind of men?" "I don't know. They looked scary." Claire and Eleanor exchanged worried glances. "Did they say anything?" Claire asked. Lily nodded slowly. "One of them told Dad he had until the end of the month to pay what he owed." The implication was clear. Andrew's financial problems were worse than anyone had imagined. A few hours later, Melissa arrived at the house looking panicked. She hurried inside and immediately hugged Lily before turning toward Eleanor and Claire. "You know, don't you?" she asked breathlessly. Eleanor nodded. "Claire told me about the debts." Melissa sank into a chair. I didn't want things to go this far, she said quietly. But Andrew thought he could fix everything. Fix it how? Eleanor asked. By selling the house, Melissa replied. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Melissa looked genuinely ashamed. I know what we did was wrong, she continued. But Andrew believed if he could get $500,000 quickly, he could pay off the people he owes. Claire frowned. Who exactly does he owe? Melissa hesitated before answering. Not banks. The meaning was obvious. Eleanor suddenly understood the urgency behind Andrew's behavior. His threats, his anger, his attempts to control the estate, it was all driven by fear. Andrew wasn't just trying to secure an inheritance. He was trying to save himself and possibly protect his family from dangerous creditors. Eleanor stood up slowly. So the plan was to force me out of my own house to solve Andrew's debts. Melissa looked down. Yes. The room remained silent for several seconds before Eleanor spoke again. Then we're going to solve the situation, she said calmly. Claire looked surprised.
How?
Eleanor folded her arms thoughtfully. By creating a solution that protects the children and removes Andrew's ability to manipulate the estate. Melissa looked confused. You would still help him after everything? Eleanor's voice remained steady. I'm not helping Andrew, she said. I'm protecting my grandchildren. The night after Melissa's confession, Eleanor barely slept. She sat for hours in Daniel's study, surrounded by the papers that had slowly revealed the truth about her son's actions. The room felt different now, no longer just a quiet place where Daniel had worked on business contracts or balanced the family accounts. It had become a place where Eleanor was piecing together the story of how her own family had nearly collapsed. The realization that Andrew had been driven not only by greed, but also by desperation complicated everything. Eleanor felt anger, certainly, but beneath that anger was something more difficult to confront. She saw a frightened version of the boy she had raised, someone who had made terrible decisions and then tried to bury them under lies. By morning, she had made a decision. The situation could end in one of two ways. She could push forward with a full legal investigation, expose the forged documents, and allow the law to handle Andrew's crimes. That path would almost certainly lead to criminal charges. Or she could attempt something far more difficult, forcing Andrew to face his actions while still protecting what remained of their family. Neither option would be easy. Late that afternoon, Eleanor called Andrew and asked him to come to the house the following evening. She told him Claire and Melissa would also be present. Andrew sounded suspicious on the phone, but he agreed to come. Eleanor spent the rest of the day preparing for the conversation. She worked with Margaret to draft a legal document outlining a proposal that could potentially resolve the crisis. It was a complicated arrangement involving a family trust, strict financial oversight, and several conditions that Andrew would have to accept if he wanted any help at all. The next evening, Andrew arrived looking exhausted. The confident man who had threatened her only days earlier seemed almost unrecognizable. His suit was wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look older than his 39 years. Claire and Melissa were already seated at the dining table when he walked in. Andrew glanced around the room, clearly sensing the tension. "What is this?" he asked cautiously. "Some kind of intervention?" "Sit down," Eleanor said calmly. Andrew pulled out a chair, but remained tense. "If this is about the house again." "It is," Eleanor interrupted. "But not in the way you expect." She slid a thick folder across the table toward him. Andrew opened it slowly. Inside was a legal agreement establishing a family trust. He skimmed the pages, confusion growing across his face. "What is this supposed to be?" Eleanor folded her hands. "The house will be transferred into the trust. That means none of us will technically own it directly." Andrew frowned. "Then what's the point?" "The trust guarantees that I will have the right to live here for the rest of my life," Eleanor continued. "After that, the property will pass equally to you and Claire." Andrew flipped through the pages again. "And how does that help me now?" Eleanor met his eyes. "The trust also includes a financial distribution." Andrew's attention sharpened immediately. How much? $200,000, Eleanor said calmly. The number hung in the air like a shockwave. Andrew looked stunned. Where would that money come from? My personal investment accounts, Eleanor replied. The ones your father set up years ago in my name alone. Andrew leaned back slowly. And you just give me that money? Not exactly. Eleanor pointed to the next section of the document. The funds would go directly toward settling your outstanding debts. Payments would be made through a trustee, not through you. Andrew's face paled slightly. You know about the debts? Yes, Eleanor said quietly. I know about the investors. I know about the threats. Melissa looked down at the table. Andrew rubbed his forehead. You don't understand how serious this situation is. I understand perfectly, Eleanor replied. That's why I'm offering a solution. Andrew glanced back at the papers. What's the catch? There are several conditions. Andrew sighed. Of course there are. Eleanor continued. First, the house remains in the trust for at least 20 years. No one can sell it during that time. Andrew nodded slowly.
Fine.
Second, Claire becomes the trustee responsible for managing the funds. Andrew looked at his sister. You'd control the money? Claire answered calmly. I'd make sure the debts are paid. That's all. Andrew hesitated, but didn't argue. And the third condition? He asked. Eleanor's voice became firmer. You enter a gambling addiction treatment program immediately. The room went silent. Andrew stared at her. You're serious? Yes. Andrew looked away. That's not necessary. It absolutely is. Andrew's jaw tightened. I don't have a problem. Claire leaned forward. You're hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Andrew didn't respond. Eleanor continued. The fourth condition is the most important. Andrew looked up again. You sign a written confession acknowledging that you forged your father's signature on the will and the financial documents. The color drained from Andrew's face. That's insane, he said quietly. Eleanor reached into another folder and placed several documents on the table. They were reports from the handwriting expert Pierce had contacted earlier that week. The signature analysis is already finished, she said. Andrew stared at the pages. You had my handwriting analyzed?
No, Eleanor corrected gently.
Your father's. The silence that followed felt heavy and final. Andrew slumped back in his chair. You'd really turn your own son over to the police? Eleanor's voice softened slightly.
No.
If you sign the confession and follow the terms of the trust, the documents remain sealed with Margaret. Andrew looked up slowly. And if I refuse? Then they go to the district attorney. The weight of the choice settled across the room. For several long minutes, Andrew said nothing. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. Finally, he spoke in a quiet voice. I didn't think it would go this far. Eleanor watched him carefully. When did it start?
Andrew sighed deeply.
A little over a year ago. I made some bad investments online. At first I thought I could recover the losses, but every time I tried I lost more. Melissa wiped a tear from her eye. You never told me how bad it was, she whispered. Andrew looked ashamed. I thought I could fix everything before anyone found out. And the will? Eleanor asked. Andrew swallowed hard. I copied Dad's signature from one of his old contracts. Claire shook her head in disbelief. You forged your father's will. Andrew covered his face with his hands. I wasn't thinking clearly. Eleanor remained silent for a moment before speaking again. The man your father was would be heartbroken by what you did. Andrew nodded slowly. I know. The room stayed quiet as Andrew picked up the pen resting beside the papers. If I sign this, he said quietly, the debts get paid and the house stays in the family? Yes, Eleanor replied. And the police never see the evidence. Not as long as you honor the agreement. Andrew looked around the table at his mother, his sister, and his wife. Finally, he lowered the pen to the page. His signature appeared slowly beneath the confession. With that single act, the power dynamic in the room changed completely. Andrew leaned back in his chair as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted. I don't deserve this kind of second chance, he admitted. Eleanor looked at him carefully. No, she said gently, but your daughters deserve a father who learns from his mistakes. 3 weeks later, the family gathered again for dinner in the same house where the conflict had begun. Andrew had already entered a treatment program and was attending counseling sessions regularly. Melissa and the girls had moved into a smaller apartment they could realistically afford. Claire had postponed her return to Denver to oversee the trust and ensure the financial arrangements remained stable. As Eleanor placed the dinner plates on the table, she realized how much had changed in such a short time. The house was still hers, protected now by legal safeguards that would prevent anyone from forcing its sale. The relationships within her family were still fragile, but they were beginning to heal. Before the meal began, Eleanor raised her glass. I'd like to make a toast, she said. Everyone looked toward her. To Daniel, she continued softly. This house was never just about money. It was about the life we built together and the family we tried to protect. Claire raised her glass. To Dad. Andrew hesitated before lifting his own. To making things right. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Eleanor returned to Daniel's study. Inside the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a letter she had discovered only days earlier, but had not yet shared with anyone. The letter was written in Daniel's familiar handwriting and dated 2 weeks before his death. In it, Daniel explained that he had begun to suspect Andrew was in financial trouble. He had started moving some assets into accounts Eleanor controlled to protect her from any future problems. He had planned to update their will again soon, but he had not finished the process. At the end of the letter, Daniel had written a final sentence. No matter what happens, remember that the most important thing we built was never this house or our savings. It was the strength of the family inside these walls. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the house stood quiet and peaceful once again. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Eleanor felt certain that his legacy had not been lost after all.